For centuries, the history of Africa was dominated by Eurocentric scholars who often portrayed the continent in a light that suited colonial narratives, completely distorting Africa's past. These scholars were not necessarily interested in the realities of African civilizations, but rather in creating a version of history that served Western interests. From the days of colonialism, African societies were painted as primitive, backward, and without contribution to the development of human civilization. As a result, the true depth and richness of Africa's history were buried under a Eurocentric lens, leaving a generation of Africans disconnected from their own heritage. In the eyes of many, African history began and ended with the European encounter. Usually with narratives focused on slavery, colonization, and the civilizing mission of Western powers. However, one African scholar who made it his mission to debunk these lies and restore the dignity of Africa's past was Theophile Obenga. A respected scholar and a master linguist, Obenga dedicated his life to exposing the biases that plagued African studies and challenged the distorted views held by Eurocentric historians. Gaga's work is pivotal because he didn't merely critique the biased history written by Europeans. He provided an alternative history that centered Africa's true contributions to human civilization. One of the earliest instances of this Eurocentric distortion was the complete erasure of African intellectual contributions. Eurocentric historians often dismiss the African past as a series of dark ages where nothing of intellectual significance occurred. Instead, the historical narrative they pushed emphasized European superiority and the belief that African cultures were inferior to those in Europe. Scholars who critiqued these Eurocentric interpretations, such as Cheikh Anta Diop, were often met with fierce resistance. Diop's work was rooted in the firm belief that ancient Egyptian civilization, often seen as the pinnacle of African achievement, was central to the history of humanity. Yet Diop's refusal to submit to the European-dominated academic narrative made him a target of those who believed that African scholars could not be the arbiters of African history. What was particularly striking about figures like Diop and later Obenga was their steadfast refusal to seek the approval of Eurocentric scholars or chase fame and recognition. Unlike Western scholars who were motivated by career advancement and awards, African scholars like Diop sought to reclaim history not for personal gain, but for the collective good of African people. Diop's commitment to African history was grounded in an ideological and intellectual pursuit to show the world that Africa was not a passive continent, but one that had contributed significantly to the development of civilization. He believed that reclaiming African history was essential not only for restoring African pride, but also for empowering future generations of Africans to understand their legacy and chart a path towards self-determination. However, Eurocentric Africanists, such as Fel Immer, were unable to comprehend why African scholars, particularly Diop, did not seek fame or accolades. Immer and his colleagues, often steeped in Western intellectual traditions, were driven by the quest for academic recognition and were baffled by the selfless dedication of scholars like Diop. This confusion stemmed from a deep-rooted belief in the intellectual hierarchy that placed Western thought above African perspectives. For Immer, The idea that African scholars like Diop could reject fame in favor of cultural restoration was both incomprehensible and unsettling. This disconnect between African intellectuals and their Eurocentric counterparts highlighted the intellectual and cultural chasm that existed in African scholarship. In response, Obenga, following in the footsteps of Diop, took it upon himself to expose the methodological flaws of Eurocentric Africanists. One of the central criticisms that Obenga leveled against these scholars was their use of language to manipulate the perception of African scholarship. The term Afrocentrism, for example, was often used by Eurocentric Africanists to delegitimize African-focused scholarship, painting it as biased or even politically motivated. This linguistic manipulation was a deliberate tactic used to undermine African scholarship and reinforce the idea that African history could not be trusted unless it was mediated through the lens of Western thought. Obenga rejected this term and highlighted its absurdity. He pointed out that labeling African scholars as Afrocentrists was akin to labeling an English professor as an Anglist simply for studying English literature and civilization. This deliberate mischaracterization sought to minimize the contributions of African scholars, implying that their work was inherently biased and unworthy of serious academic consideration. By drawing attention to this manipulation, Obenga and other African scholars exposed how language itself had been weaponized to control the narrative surrounding African history. The fight for African history was not just about reclaiming the past, but also about ensuring that future generations of Africans would be able to see their history as a source of pride, identity, and empowerment. Obenga's work, therefore, was not just about critiquing the biases of Western historians. It was about providing African communities with the intellectual tools to reconnect with their heritage. It was about dismantling the colonialist thinking that had long divided African history into artificial categories and instead promoting a more inclusive and truthful understanding of African civilization. A significant part of this effort involved challenging the myth of the Greek miracle. For centuries, the Western academic establishment had elevated Greek civilization as the ultimate source of European intellectual achievement. It was a widely held belief that Greek thought represented the height of human civilization, with little to no acknowledgement of the influence of African civilizations, particularly Egypt, on Greek philosophy, science, and culture. The notion of the Greek miracle suggested that Greek civilization emerged in isolation with no external influences. However, scholars like Martin Burnell and Theophile Obenga challenged this narrative by demonstrating how Greek civilization was deeply influenced by Egyptian culture. Despite the mounting evidence of African influence on Greece, Eurocentric scholars continued to resist these ideas. The very notion that Greece, the cradle of Western civilization, could have been influenced by African civilizations was threatening to their sense of intellectual superiority. For Eurocentric historians, accepting the Egyptian roots of Greek thought would have meant acknowledging the intellectual contributions of Africa, which directly undermined their long-held belief in European cultural and intellectual supremacy. This resistance to African contributions, especially those of ancient Egypt, exposed the deep-seated biases that still permeated Western historical thought. Obenga's critique of Eurocentric scholarship did not stop with the Greek miracle. The battle to reclaim African history was ongoing, and it took the form of a broader intellectual resistance to what Obenga described as New Africanism. This movement, which emerged as an attempt to rectify the errors of past Eurocentric scholars, quickly became another form of intellectual control. Scholars like Fel Immer, who claimed to be correcting past mistakes, maintained their dominance over African history by rebranding their old ideas under the banner of New Africanism. This rebranding did little to challenge the colonial mindset that had originally distorted African history. Instead, it perpetuated the same biases that had previously existed. Obenga compared this rebranding to expecting a mango tree to bear coconuts, an absurd proposition, as it was clear that these scholars were merely repackaging colonial ideologies and calling it progress. While they updated certain ethnographic studies and adopted more inclusive language, the core of their approach remained unchanged. They still sought to control the narrative of African history from a Western perspective, and their so-called corrections were little more than a way of maintaining the status quo. By exposing the flaws in this new approach, Obenga helped highlight the continuing struggle for intellectual liberation within African scholarship. A key part of this struggle involved language and classification. For years, Eurocentric scholars had used outdated classifications like Hamitic to divide African languages and civilizations. This division served to separate Egypt from the rest of Africa, fostering a false narrative that suggested Egypt was fundamentally different from other African societies. Scholars like Henry Tanu, who continued to promote these outdated classifications, were met with fierce criticism from Obenga, who exposed the flaws in their arguments. Tanu's attempt to separate Egypt from the rest of Africa by creating a linguistic divide was an intellectually dishonest move designed to reinforce colonialist ideas of racial hierarchy. Obenga's work on African historical linguistics played a crucial role in debunking these artificial divisions. By showing how African languages were interconnected, he demonstrated that there was a shared intellectual and cultural heritage across Africa. He argued that the language of ancient Egypt, Kemet, was part of a larger African linguistic family, and that the cultural practices of Egypt were not isolated but shared by many other African civilizations. Aha! The idea that African societies were fundamentally separate from one another was rooted in colonial thinking and ignored the real historical and linguistic connections that existed between African peoples. One of the most significant aspects of Obenga's critique was his examination of how Eurocentric scholars had used flawed comparisons to misrepresent African culture. Figures like Pascal Vernes made inaccurate comparisons between Egyptian and Semitic languages, attempting to create a false narrative that separated Egypt from the rest of Africa. Obenga criticized this approach, pointing out that such comparisons were often made without rigor and lacked the scholarly depth needed to be taken seriously. By distorting the cultural connections between Egypt and other African civilizations, Eurocentric scholars were able to perpetuate the myth that Egypt was a unique and separate civilization, distinct from the broader African context. Obenga's work exposed these flaws in scholarship, challenging the very foundations of how African history was understood. His insistence on the interconnectedness of African cultures and languages helped reframe the way scholars approached African history. By rejecting the artificial divisions created by colonial scholars, Obenga called for a more inclusive and accurate understanding of African civilization, one that recognized the contributions of African peoples across the continent. Furthermore, Obenga's critique extended beyond the academic world. He recognized that reclaiming African history was not just an intellectual pursuit, was an act of cultural restoration. African history had been suppressed for centuries, and this erasure had profound consequences for African identity and self-perception. By reclaiming African history, African scholars were not only correcting historical inaccuracies, they were also empowering African communities to reconnect with their cultural heritage and assert their intellectual agency. Obenga's work continues to resonate today as scholars and activists around the world strive to challenge the biases embedded in Eurocentric narratives of African history. His insistence on the importance of African scholarship, free from the influence of colonialism, laid the groundwork for future generations to explore African history on their own terms. The fight for African history is far from over. But Obenga's legacy remains a powerful reminder of the importance of intellectual liberation and the need to reclaim Africa's rightful place in world history. Through his work, Obenga helped dismantle the myths of Eurocentric Africanism and provided a blueprint for future African scholars to follow. By embracing African perspectives and centering African voices, we can rewrite the history of the continent in a way that is both truthful and empowering. This intellectual liberation is not just about correcting the past. It is about shaping the future and ensuring that African history is understood as it truly is, rich, diverse, and integral to the development of human civilization.